So the Bitcoin blockchain can only handle about 7 transactions per second. Is this too slow? It doesn't seem like a lot when you compare it to other payment networks like Visa, which can handle thousands of transactions per second. So can Bitcoin actually work as a payment method? Well, first of all, to understand this, you have to understand that when a lot of people who criticize Bitcoin, they say it's too old, it's too slow, they are comparing the base network of Bitcoin to a third or even fourth order magnitude of payment layers. So what I mean by that is Visa is not the base layer of money, right? Credit card networks are not the base layer of money, right? The base layer of money is the Federal Reserve network and those payments. When you think of like regional banks on top of that, and then credit card networks on top of that, this isn't the base chain of money, right? This isn't the final settlement layer of money. And the same way with Bitcoin, you don't need final settlement on the blockchain to do day-to-day commerce, day-to-day transactions. So yes, you need security and finality on the base Bitcoin network, but you don't need that if you're just going to buy a coffee. And that's when layer 2s come into play, right? Think of a layer 2 like a bar tab, right? You go to the bar, you purchase drinks all night, and then you settle your transaction with you settle a bunch of smaller transactions with one larger transaction. So you settle your tab with one swipe of your card. You don't swipe your card and then tip and sign every single time you want to buy a drink. You do it a bunch of times, the bar keeps track of it, and then you settle all at once, which is the same thing as something like the Bitcoin Lightning Network. The Bitcoin Lightning Network is another abstraction on top of the Bitcoin blockchain that keeps track of a bunch of smaller transactions, right? Because you're going to, you spend, 5,000 Satoshis or small pieces of Bitcoin for a cup of coffee, right? You don't really care to know that your money arrived at its destination. Obviously, you trust in the system, but you don't need to go track that this had final settlement. And so what I mean by that is if you sent a lot of Bitcoin to someone, right? If you sent a lot of Bitcoin from your exchange to your hardware wallet, you are going to want to look at that transaction and track it as it gets propagated and eventually included in a block, because it's very important to you that that transaction, you can view its settlement on the base layer of money. And it's the same way in the traditional financial network, right? Large, massive transactions, that's when you need that final settlement, right? You don't need final settlement on a Visa transaction, right? On a Chipotle bowl. And it's the same thing with Bitcoin. So the base layer of Bitcoin won't be for day-to-day commerce, right? Just buying food or something like that. It will be for large transactions, like transferring your wealth from one wallet to another, buying a car, putting a down payment on a house, things like that. Large transactions where you would really have an investment in seeing that transaction gets included in a block and you can verify that the transaction went through, right? You don't care about that if you're buying a Chipotle bowl, or it's at least not as important to you. And if that's more important to you, then you're willing to pay the larger fees. And so next I'll talk about why it's important that Bitcoin has small blocks and why it's actually the main feature of Bitcoin is that the transactions are slow. So when you compare Bitcoin to another type of blockchain or another crypto that pretends that it competes with Bitcoin, those crypto projects, those blockchains have much larger blocks. So they allow for much more transactions on the base layer. So they sacrifice security and decentralization on the base layer of the money, the base settlement layer, for speed, right? Faster doesn't always mean better. Faster and cheaper transactions doesn't mean it's a better system. So for example, something like Solana has tons of transactions per second. It's constantly churning through transactions, and that's why it's pretty cheap to send a Solana transaction. But the reason that is like I said, they sacrifice security and decentralization to obtain speed on the base layer. There's only about 750 nodes in the Solana network, right? To run a node, you have to download an entire copy of the blockchain and validate incoming transactions against that entire history, right? If you have giant blocks with a ton of transactions coming in all the time, you're going to need like an industrial grade computer in order to process that many transactions. So Bitcoin's small blocks and slow transactions, right? Relatively higher fees, which, those fees are still low, I would argue, currently on the Bitcoin base layer. But that's actually a feature, not a bug, right? That doesn't make Bitcoin slow and outdated technology, which a lot of people who are trying to sell you on another crypto token who says that their token is the new Bitcoin and it's better than Bitcoin, right? Think twice about that and ask yourself, would you trade security and decentralization on the base settlement layer for speed, right? Especially when you can achieve that same speed and transaction or low fees on a second layer, right? That's how Square was able to enable Bitcoin payments to millions of merchants. That's enabled by the Bitcoin Lightning Network. You can use the Lightning Network to settle much faster and cheaper. That's the way they were able to enable that by using the Lightning Network. And if you use it, the fees are incredibly low, if not zero, on those transactions. So if someone tells you Bitcoin is slow and outdated, use this line of reasoning and you'll be able to shut them down pretty quickly, because Bitcoin is slow by design. And that means that anyone can run a Bitcoin node, which is what makes it decentralized. There's tens of thousands of Bitcoin nodes running the Bitcoin software. Ask someone who likes Solana, do you run a Solana node? Ask someone who likes XRP if they run an XRP node in their basement. They probably don't, because there's only 150 to 750 nodes on these networks. They're not truly decentralized. Decentralization is a spectrum. Something like the XRP network, which only has about 150 validators, sure, it's more decentralized than the Federal Reserve. There's 13 branches of the Federal Reserve Bank, but does that mean it's decentralized when you compare it to Bitcoin, which has tens of thousands of validators on the network, right? What does decentralized even mean then? It's a spectrum, right? So that's about it for Bitcoin and why its transaction slowness and relative expense is actually a feature. And if you enjoy the content, subscribe to the channel. And yeah, I'll see you in the next one. As always, together, let's work, save, and build a brighter future with Bitcoin. See you in the next one.